If you're visiting Chicago, one of the first things people usually will tell you is take one of those architecture river cruises. And once you start looking for companies, you'll notice there are quite a few different companies out there offering about the same thing. Now, we recently took the Wendella River Cruise as well as the First Lady. And depending on the ratings at the time, both river cruises are usually in the top tiers. Now, both cruises are very similar, but there are also a lot of differences too as well. Today, we're going to go over the biggest differences that I saw. Also, we took one in the spring when it was around 60-degree weather. We also took one in the summer last year, but it was 85 degrees, sunny and hot. And I'll explain why that also makes a difference too as well when deciding whether or not you want to do the river cruises. And then I'm going to let you know what I personally liked and which river cruise would be the best fit for you on your trip to Chicago. My name is Shane with Mapbound, and I'm bringing you insights from 25 plus years of international travel. And welcome. Now, before we start talking about the differences of both river cruises, let's talk about what they both do well. Now, keep in mind that both river cruises are going to have similar itineraries, and they both do have options to go on the lake as well as options to go further down the river. It's just Wendella focuses and excels more on the lake side of the architecture cruises, whereas First Lady strives on being on just the river itself. Both cruises focus on Chicago's famous architecture. They also both have knowledgeable tour guides that explain the city's history to you. And of course, being that they're river cruises, they both take you on the Chicago River. Both of them also showcase a lot of Chicago's iconic skyscrapers. And lastly, they are both about 90 minutes long. No matter which river cruise you choose, you're going to get great views and a lot of good history from both. There is a real difference between the two, and that is the route that they both take. Now, one of the biggest things that you'll notice with Wendella, for instance, is they actually take you onto Lake Michigan so that you can see views from the lake as well as from the river. And because of this, you're going to have to go through their famous lock system too as well. So this basically means that you get something that most visitors don't get to see. Now, one of my favorite things about Wendella is that when you go into Lake Michigan, the views from the lake of Chicago's iconic Skyline are amazing. When you do go through the lock system and you are out on the lake, you get to go out further enough that you get to see Chicago's skyline from Lake Michigan, and it really does open up the view. You also get to go around Navy Pier and see Chicago's skyline from a few different angles. And of course, you get to experience Lake Michigan and its lakefront. And because of this, it does create a lot of photo opportunities for you. So for photographers, or maybe even the first time person in Chicago, definitely Wendella might be the option for you. Either way, each one of these are going to give you great views of the iconic Chicago skyline. Neither is a bad choice, it just depends on which one's going to be best for the experience that you want. Have you taken an architecture river cruise in Chicago? Let us know how your trip went, as well as let us know what company you chose. I would love to hear your insights. Now, however, there is a trade-off. And since you do go into Lake Michigan, you do have to go through the lock system. And going through the lock system takes time, as well as it also depends on the boat traffic that day. So I want to say we spent a good probably 40 minutes maybe in just the lock system. To me, that's a drawback because you're just waiting there for the ship to get onto the lake. So don't get me wrong, the lake views are spectacular, but you do waste a good portion of your cruise going through the lock system. And not just once, twice. So with First Lady, it takes a different approach. They actually get to the lock system, but then they turn around. So this makes it that you have a lot more time going on the Chicago River. And since you're on the Chicago River more, you're going to be able to see a lot more of their architecture. Now, they both take the same path on the river all the way until they get to the T. First Lady, it actually takes you down both the north side and the south side of the river, whereas Wendella does not. Once Wendella gets to the T, they turn around. Now, one of the things I really liked about the First Lady is I did not see that part of the river on the Wendella cruise. And there was a lot more information, and you got to go closer to a lot more of the architecture on the river. One of the key buildings is the Willis Tower, used to be called the Sears Tower, was once the tallest building in the world, and it's still one of the major highlights in the Chicago skyline. Now, of course, you can see it almost anywhere, but you get really close. And my favorite view of the Willis Tower is actually on the First Lady River Cruise. So with First Lady, instead of wasting time in the locks, you're actually doing a river cruise throughout the entire 90 minutes. Whereas Wendella, you are still getting a river cruise, but yet you spend about 40 minutes in those lock systems. So if you're more interested in the history and the architecture of Chicago, I recommend First Lady because that's going to be where you get a lot more information and see a lot more of the architecture up close. So at the end of the day, when it comes to both river cruises, it's really going to depend on what kind of views and what kind of commentaries you prefer to have. Now, Wendella we did first, and the reason I picked that one first is because I've lived around Chicago my entire life, but I have not ever done the river cruise. So since it was my first time, I was like, I kind of do want to see the Chicago skyline from Lake Michigan. So that's why we chose that one first. You're going to get really good views of the skyline, so you can take video or take pictures. From Lake Michigan, it really does give the cities its perspective on the scale of how many skyscrapers it has and how big Chicago really is. So if you think you'll like seeing Chicago from both the river and the lake, then I would definitely go with Wendella. Now, another thing too is what else you got planned while you're in Chicago? Because if you're going up in one of the skyscrapers to their viewing area, you're going to see the perspective of the city and Lake Michigan and everything up there. So if you're doing that and you're in a time crunch, maybe go with First Lady. And I'd also go with First Lady if you're mostly interested in the architecture and you want to maximize your time on the river. And if you want to spend the time in the lock systems and you want more of that river coverage, of course, First Lady has that to offer. And of course, you get to see more of the Chicago skyline from the river. First Lady, we enjoyed both of them, and I'm glad that I did, and as well as I'm glad we spaced it out a little bit and didn't do it all on one trip. Now, also keep in mind for these two river cruises, they also had a bathroom, they both had a bar, and when it came to the seating was basically the same too as well. Now, as for the pricing, just keep in mind that these prices are what they were when I looked, so they may have changed by the time you decide to book. I have noticed that Wendella was the cheaper option. It was generally around $45 for a ticket. But when you go to First Lady, it's usually around $60 for a ticket, depending on if you want priority boarding or not. Yeah, if it's gonna be a packed ship, I can see getting priority boarding, but the two times I've been on river cruises, it wasn't really necessary. Another thing to keep in mind is the weather. The first one we went on was the Wendella cruise, and it was hot and sunny, and you think that would be amazing, but we ended up having to go to the lower decks because the sun was too bright, looking up at all the architecture. Now, the second time we went, it was more like in the 60s. It was a little cold, but there was no sun, so it actually made it easier to view the architecture. And it wasn't super cold, it was just a little windy. And of course, no trip to Chicago is complete without trying its world-famous pizza. On our first visit, we stopped at the Chicago Pizza and Oven Grinder Company for their legendary pizza pot pie. Extra cheesy, saucy, and packed full of flavor. On our second trip, we finally tried Pequod's deep dish pizza, famous for its caramelized crust and loaded with pepperoni, cheese, and sauce. Two iconic pizzas, two completely different experiences. Are you team pizza pot pie or team deep dish? Personally, I give a slight edge to Pequod's deep dish pizza. But honestly, the pizza pot pie was incredible as well. You really can't go wrong with either one. Prices are similar at both restaurants, and I highly recommend making a reservation because these iconic Chicago spots stay packed. So with Wendella, of course, you get those awesome skyline views from Lake Michigan. But with First Lady, you get a lot more of the architecture and history of Chicago. Neither one felt like a bad choice. I'm glad I did both of them. So it really actually comes down to whether or not you're going to want to see the iconic Chicago skyline from the lake, or if you prefer to stay on the river and get more of the architecture. So if it's your first time to Chicago, you might actually want to be on the lake and get those iconic views from Lake Michigan. Now, if you're an architecture enthusiast or you enjoy getting the history and facts about Chicago's skyline, First Lady would be who I would choose, as they are going to be on the river more. My name is Shane with Mapbound. Be sure to check out my cruise recommended products. Also check out my website and follow me on Facebook. And remember, travel is life.